Hey guys, I'm learning TFT and I'm sharing my learnings with you so you can learn and I can learn better as well. In this video, I'm going to go through an analysis I did that was actually suggested by Brosif, who is currently ranked 2 NA. I shared the itemization advanced guide that he put together in my last video, and he had a suggestion in being able to value each item based off of some equivalent component value. And so I went through and I did some analysis on that where I went through each item, the stats it gives, and then came up with some exchange rate on the component value. And I'm going to kind of compare that with the stats as well as a kind of item performance by stage analysis. So I'm going to kind of cross-reference this analysis with some by stage performance analysis I did before and overall stats as well. So that's kind of the analysis I'm going to put together. But before I do that, I'm going to go through the meta mindset of the day, which is a psychological segment where I talk about psychology and philosophy that should help us get better at TFT, both in the short term and the long term, and also should be hopefully allow you to abstract some of these ideas and improve your life as well. So if you'd like to jump to the this analysis, the how much is each TFT item worth in components, take a look at the timestamp in the description below and you can jump straight to that section. So before we get there, I'm going to do the meta mindset of the day, which is your assumptions shape your reality. So the kind of inspiration behind this meta mindset is because I am drawing from Brosif's suggestion to think about how much each TFT item is worth in terms of components. I'm basically saying that, or Brosif is basically suggesting, think about each item as some equivalent exchange rate. All right, think about metaphor or how you translate one thing into another, or how you whatever assumptions you have about something is a metaphor that you have for how it works. And there's an amazing book by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, probably one of my favorite top maybe 5 to 10 books of all time, and I've read probably over 1,000 books. It's a very abstract concept, but I think if you actually have the patience to like kind of sit through this, I think a lot of it will make a lot more sense once we come out the other side. And there will definitely be some very applicable learnings to TFT and how we learn TFT, but also more broadly, how you view life. This is just a very foundational concept that has frankly changed the way I perceive reality. All right, so one of the basic ideas from this book is that the essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. So when we go back to thinking about Brosif's suggestion, thinking about items as how many components it's worth, right? So when you change your metaphors, they change how you play, and different frameworks can affect your perception of the game. So when you understand like BIS, for someone that has never heard of the concept BIS, best in slot items, they would not necessarily think of the game as solving and greeting for those items. They might just slam items in the beginning, right? But once a player learns this idea of BIS, they suddenly see the game through a completely different lens and may play the game in a completely different way. And arguably one of the reasons that a lot of new players, I would argue, actually make a lot of mistakes is once they learn this concept of BIS, they oftentimes greet it so much that it actually hurts their play more than it helps. And this happens a lot in TFT just in general. When you learn a new concept or new metaphor, you may focus excessively on it, right? And another way of looking at this is that metaphors are the lens, the glasses through which you view reality. Your assumptions are just like wearing glasses. And so if I put on these glasses versus sunglasses versus contacts or like a different strength glasses, it changes what I see, because when I take off my glasses, certain things look more blurry, but when I put them on, other things look very sharp, right? They continue to say new metaphors can have the power to define reality. They do this through a coherent network of entailments that highlight some features of reality and hide others. So when you have a metaphor like bis, you really focus on items as like this central feature of the game, and maybe you hide other aspects of the game like HP preservation. And so the acceptance of the metaphor, which forces us to focus only on those aspects of our experience that it highlights, leads us to view the details of that metaphor as being true. So there's a lot going on here, but the basic idea is going back to your assumptions shape your reality. The lens through which you view the world affects what you see. And so what you're seeing is not necessarily the world in an objective state, but what you're seeing at any time in reality or in the game of TFT is merely your brain filtering the game or reality through your assumptions and the lens that you're viewing it in. Which is why when we go back and do VOD reviews, both of your own games and of top streamers, you will actually see different things. Even when you just VOD review yourself. And part of it is just you have a lot more bandwidth when you can slow down and pause, that you'll see different features of reality that you might not have seen otherwise. And that is the beauty of going back and VOD reviewing, especially when you were able to listen to what a streamer is saying, especially if it's a streamer who kind of talks out loud in their thought process as opposed to purely for entertainment. And by the way, when you watch a lot of VODs of streamers that actually do play for entertainment and like complain a lot and have a negative kind of talk track, that is a metaphor that you are then consuming for yourself. And this is true for life too. Like people that watch a lot of like news, well, a lot of news is skewed towards negative thought patterns. And therefore, when you actually adopt that lens or that metaphor for perceiving life, and then you go out into the world, or TFT, you watch a lot of Soju or someone that complains a lot, then when you play TFT, you will likely adopt that same talk track, right? And then you hide, so it highlights those experiences or the things about that metaphor that seem true to you, so you pay more attention to when you low roll, and it will hide aspects of your experience of life where maybe you're high rolling or there's something positive that happened to you in life, but because your lens is focusing on the negative, you're actually not seeing the positive, and you're disqualifying the positive. That's actually a psychological perception of cognitive behavioral therapy as well. Our concepts structure what we perceive, how we get around in the world, and how we relate to other people. Our conceptual system, or metaphors, thus play a central role in defining our everyday realities. If we are right that our conceptual system is largely metaphorical, then the way we think, what we experience, and what we do every day is very much a matter of metaphor. I talked about how if the metaphor that you use in TFT is BIS, or is a specific comp, as opposed to, like, let's say, I talked about Dynamo Flex recently. If you think about the game in terms of fixed comps, you will never really consider that even a single line can have very different front lines, right? Because the perception, the metaphor, the system that you use in perceiving the game is, well, this game's about comps. Well, what is a comp? It's about a fixed set of units that I'm putting into my team planner. And so for some newer players, they're not even clicking any other units other than those units in the team planner, right? And so that can be a useful metaphor to view the game, just like BIS is a useful metaphor to view the game for a new player. But if you only look at the world through that lens, then it really limits your perception of the game itself. It limits your perception of reality, and it hides a lot of aspects that you do not see. There's actually a lot of psychological research that says that the when you lack or okay, so here's another example. If I don't know if you've seen the um, gorilla psychology video. So this is called selective attention.
This is a test of selective attention.
Okay, so the goal of this test is actually for an observer to view the number of times I believe that the participants in this video pass the ball to each other. I think that's what's happening.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball.
Okay, I must speed it up. So count how many times the players wearing white. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Right. I might have missed some, but how many passes did you count?
The correct answer is 15.
So I missed like a couple, right?
And it's copyrighted. It is available.
But the key thing is that because we are focused on the white team and the number of passes, what they actually found is that, I forget the exact learnings. What was the takeaway from the selective attention gorilla psychology test? But I think the basic idea is that when you are focused, the invisible gorilla, when you are focused on one thing, right, that is the lens that you are searching or experiencing reality through. What was found is that half of the participants who did this test, and I actually even primed your brain because I said it was a gorilla test, right? But half of the people did not even notice that there was a black gorilla right here that was walking through and even did a dance, right? Half the people didn't even see that. When we are intensely, so the idea is that when we are focusing our attention on a specific thing and we're intensely focused on it, we might miss other surprising or important events, even when it's right in front of us. And so when we go back to this idea about how our perception of reality is metaphorical, and if you view the game through the lens of BIS or through the lens of comps or through whatever it is that you have learned about the game in one way or the other, whether that's from a TFT video, some Reddit post, from a friend, that will limit your perception of reality. Nobody sees reality in its like just pristine objective form. There's just too much data flowing at us at any time, and so our brains have to simplify by allowing our brains to focus our attention on some subset of the data that is entering our brain and filtering and excluding some other subset, right? And metaphors are the lens through which we do that. Julian Jaynes, in the book The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, I talked about some of his ideas in my previous meta mindset. And this is, again, one of the key books behind the TV show Westworld, which highly recommend. Very much about AI simulation and just what does it mean to be conscious and to be perceptive as a conscious being. He said, metaphor is not a mere extra trick of language. It is the very constitutive ground of language. And it is by metaphor that language grows. So an idea here is that when you get coaching or when you self-review your VODs or you learn through YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, those are ways that you can replace your outdated metaphors. So for example, you can go from knowing nothing to understanding this term BIS, best in slot, right? And the idea here is that your perception of reality, your language grows by metaphor. And he actually starts by saying one basic idea is like heat. Or warmth actually starts off by a baby understanding the warmth of the mother's touch. And you then build language through that way. Or when you're trying to teach a baby or a toddler language for the first time, you're pointing at a thing and then you're saying a word, right? You're attaching that word to that thing, like water, wawa. Like when my kids were learning water, we would just say wawa because it's very hard to say water, right? Wawa, right? And then because my kids actually learned Mandarin first, we say sway. But then it's also interesting when kids learn, bilingual kids learn, like you could call the same thing multiple things, right? Sway or wawa or water. And you then kind of learn that, especially I think bilingual kids, you learn that it's the finger pointing at the object. There's the Buddhist idea that the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon itself. And furthermore, when you call the moon 月亮 in Chinese, or moon, or like the word you use is not the thing itself. And furthermore, when you can describe the thing itself in multiple terms, you also realize like, well, that thing is separate from the metaphor that you were pointing at it. And so James continues to say, language is an organ of perception, not simply a means of communication. So language affects what we see. So if I use the term bis, it affects my perception of the game. If your language includes a lot of negative connotation, it tints your perception of reality to be more negative. And so the language you are using, the internal talk track in your head, is not just a way to communicate to other people. It affects what you see, just like this right here, right? That language affects what your brain filters in and out. So what you name a thing matters. If you call like TFT Academy for some time, before I put together my Dynamo Flex guide, they had actually named this comp Dynamo MF Flex, I believe. And that's why I was saying that your language is an organ of perception. What you name a thing affects how you perceive the comp, right? So when this was called Dynamo MF Flex, I actually perceived this comp as an AD comp. It wasn't until I talked to Marcel and the mental shift or metaphor that shifted was, he said, view Elise as a forecast. Elise is the core around you, how you view this comp. And that completely shifted my mental framework to how to play and approach Dynamo Flex. It was no longer an AD comp. This was a hyper cost-effective, flexible AP and AD line depending on what I hit, but a lot of it is built around, okay, get a quick Elise 2 and then I could go fast 9 because it's so cost effective and the front line is completely flexible. But when this was called Dynamo MF Flex, I viewed it very fixed. It's like, oh, I need to roll on level 8 as a fast 8 comp for MF, right? And so that language of what we use, what we call things, affects the perception and all in the extended metaphors that I drew from the even just the simple label of Dynamo MF Flex. And so I know a lot of people will probably, I might be getting a lot of comments who do not get through this video, or maybe what I'm trying to communicate, the metaphors I'm using and the language I'm using is too complex and not simplified enough, since I am still trying to process many of these ideas myself to come up with simpler and simpler metaphors to explain the concepts that are identified here. But I can definitely see some people be like, what are you talking about? Like, just shut up and, go to the basic video, right? But the idea here is that the language matters, the perception matters, right? And that I'm going to get to that when I get to this analysis here, right, of the component value. But just thinking about items in terms of component value, even just doing this analysis, and I'm going to talk through it, but this will affect the way that I, and probably if you actually get through this analysis later, view items, and simplifies how I view things, especially when they have patches. Then, for example, they adjusted what was it, Spirit Visage from 200 to 300 HP. And one way of, if you view it as items, it's 150 HP for a Giant's Belt. So that is increased by 0.7-ish items. And so you can think, if you think about it in component values, it makes the whole system easier to understand and how to perceive the value of items. Carl Jung said, "A succession of words does not have only one meaning, but men strive to assign only a single meaning to the sequence of words in order to have an unambiguous language." So this comes in. The basic idea here is that people are uncomfortable with multiple meanings to a certain thing. People are very uncomfortable with uncertainty and not having a shared understanding of the world. And so one of the challenges that I always, stories that I always go back to is like this dress. I don't know which one's the original image. I think it's this one. Right? Like, if you haven't seen this before, the question I would pose for you is, what color do you see this dress as? And for me, I see a blue and black dress here. But I think I forget what percentage of the population see different dress here. Let's see. So there's a certain percentage of people that see gold and white. Let's ask ChatGPT. What percent of the population saw what colors for the blue, black, gold, white dress that went viral? But while we're waiting for ChatGPT, the basic idea is that people are uncomfortable that other people could be seeing the same thing and be seeing a completely different thing, right? And so, what was it? 57% people saw blue and black, which is what I saw. 30% saw white and gold. Wow, I didn't realize that 11% saw blue and brown. This is also related to the idea of qualia, which is, how do you know that, like, what I experience as red is the same as what you experience as red, right? And if we go back to what we're trying to get here, is that a lot of philosophers and psychology, like, folks would argue that we can't. Like, a succession of words does not have only one meaning, but we all want, human nature wants to, like, nail it down to be like, okay, it is this one thing, right? And so in a TFT context, Marcel said in his Reddit post about how to get better, one of the big traps is thinking in always and never. There's too much nuance in TFT for that line of thinking. When you use the words never and always in TFT and in life, it's dangerous because you don't account for context. And yet that's what human nature wants to do. We want to be able to use this term never and always. And this is also why I think the world today, from a political standpoint, is so binary. Like, you have the left and the right, you have Democrats and Republicans, you have people that are putting other people into a box, like, well, if you think this, then everything that comes out of your mouth is complete garbage and bullshit, and, like, you are the enemy, right? And it's challenging because that's also a metaphor that we use. Isaac Asimov, the sci-fi writer, said, "Your assumptions are your windows on the world. Scrub them off every once in a while, or the light won't come in." So this is definitely true in a TFT context, is when you can challenge your assumptions, which from a mental standpoint is just to say, I don't know everything. Like, inhabit a beginner's mind. Wash off your glasses. Consider what it might be like if you, what your assumptions and your metaphors and your perception of the world maybe isn't true. What might happen, right? And Franz de Waal said, I think he was an evolutionary psychologist, said, reality is a mental construct. So this is similar to the idea that the map is not the territory, like the example of the moon. The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon itself. And another idea here is that reality is a shared illusion and collaborated mental construct. If we think about this from a TFT standpoint, so another way of framing this is that reality is subjective. Our interpretation of reality is subjective based off of the metaphors that we hold. For example, going back to the invisible gorilla example, and I need to use that in the video thumbnail. But if we assume that reality is what we see, that our perception of reality is reality itself, that it's fixed, that then no innovation will occur, like from a TFT standpoint, right? If you're aware that instead that it is shared and collaborated, I'm probably even using this wrong, collaborative mental construct. Basically, it's this idea that what you see in the meta is just our shared hallucination of it. That it does not mean that we have the optimal solved approach to the meta. And we can see this when players like Appies or Wigwug, who I think they understand that reality for TFT in any patch is a mental construct, a shared mental construct. They get this. The people that don't get this are the people that complain and say, well, this meta sucks because X, Y, and Z, and they're not really challenging their perception of the meta. They're not challenging the shared mental construct. They assume that what they see is objective truth. Instead, Appies and Wigwug are saying, no, like, that isn't true. What we see in the stats, how players perceive this reality that we all roughly agree on, is what we know so far, and that there is a shroud of war, or there is unknown stuff that we have not, as a collective, explored. And when they are willing to test the boundaries of what they are exploring of this shared mental construct, that allows you to both play within the meta and innovate outside of it. All right, so I know that these concepts are very fuzzy and kind of out there. I'm still, again, trying to work my way through it. And this is, by talking through this stuff, it actually helps me learn and assimilate the information better in my mind. Because this is so abstract, I would love to hear your thoughts, however it is that you are interpreting it, whatever, assumptions, lens, metaphors that you are holding to be able to even understand the concepts of these metaphors. I would love to hear. This is the stuff I love talking about, philosophizing about this stuff. But with that said, I'm going to jump into the analysis on how to value how much is each TFT item worth in terms of the component value of those items, and then kind of compare that with the stats as well. All right. So before I dive into that, I actually had to first kind of use an augment breakdown of like basically going through item augments and figuring out how many equivalent components that gives, because then I had to have an exchange rate of damage amp, like Glass Cannon gives damage amp, so then I could convert this silver value of the augment here into components, and then like basically do this 13% damage amp for this silver divided by 2 components is 6.6 damage amp per component. Similar analysis for Omnivamp, and then some equivalent value for gold to be able to come up with some of the conversion rates here for like Hand of Justice, for example. All right. So I'm just going to kind of talk through them and then discuss like kind of when, and so again, context matters when we go back to this idea of metaphors. It's not just, okay, what's the component value, but we need to understand when things are strong and when things are weaker. So Gargoyle's Stoneplate has a lot of component value. If we assume base of 5.7, and then for the arm, if you are positioning this correctly, I'm assuming in stage 2, 4 enemies attacking your solo frontline in the beginning, which means you're going to get 40 armor magic resist, which is equivalent to 8 components in value. So 5.7 plus 8 is 13.7 base component value if you have a solo frontline in stage 2, which is why when I've seen streamers mention that if you compare this to Warmog, which one's better early game, they would usually slam Stoneplate. That's if you have a 2-star unit, especially if you have both this and this. You basically have an unkillable frontline because the component value of this is so insane. It's not as high when you compare. Where's Warmog? 64% Warmog in stage 2 versus 62% Stoneplate. But I suspect that if you have a 2-star unit, this generally should do better than Warmog. And the thing is, Warmog will be able to scale better in the late game because as the units level up, this 12% HP scales. And if you have more belt items that you're adding, or you have more percent HP boosts. Actually, I don't know if this Bramble, for example, 7% max HP is additive or multiplicative. If you happen to know, definitely include a timestamp or a comment with a timestamp here. I would really appreciate that, and I think others would as well. All right, so that's why Stoneplate is so valuable. And then when we look at Stoneplate here, one thing to keep in mind is that by the way, one way of looking at tiers is to draw a diagonal line here because you want to kind of balance play rate and AVP. Because the more something is played, the lower the AVP will be, just because everybody has it. Like if everybody in the game had always built Warmog, then this would be guaranteed to be 4.5 average placement. So it would revert to it would go push to the mean, right? But Stoneplate here is lower in AVP than Warmog, and that's because Warmog should scale better into the late game. The stage 6 win rate of Stoneplate is 51 versus 52 here. And so even though this component value is higher in the early game, you're probably not going to... I mean, you can solo frontline in the late game, but odds are your frontline unit is just going to die instantly, even though it still has that much armor MR, that you're probably better off having a little split aggro, which means that this value goes down over time. Whereas Warmog's value increases over time as you star up your units, especially as you get like 4 costs. 2-star tanks have much more HP than like 1 cost 2-star tanks. And then if you're able to cap out with Zac basically keeps on scaling this 12% max HP. So scales very, very well into the late game. Next in component value is Adaptive Helm, specifically when it's frontline. And so I think if we go to the stats for Adaptive, and I always had a hard time trying to value like, oh, which one's better, frontline or backline Adaptive Helm? And we can see in the late game, Zac is very good. I guess it's kind of split, but what this would indicate is that the front line is probably better because you're getting 40 armor magic resist, which gives you 12 component value, whereas backline gives you 5.5 plus mana gen, which if we compared it to the other mana gen items, where's Shojin? Okay, blue buff is 5 plus mana gen. Where's Shojin? Shojin is 4 plus mana gen. So it has slightly better component value than Shojin, but part of that value is in the MR. You're getting 2 component value in MR, which if you move it to backline is 3.5 if you aren't really accounting for the magic resist, which would be lower value than Shojin in just component value. Obviously, you have to kind of account for, okay, well, what's 5 bonus mana per attack value, depending on your attack speed of your carry, versus I think this is 10 mana every 3 seconds. You kind of have to do some conversion right there. But I think by default, adaptive is very strong on frontline for that reason. So this analysis helps me like kind of understand why adaptive is good. And if we go back to this chart here, we'll see that adaptive is extremely strong if we draw this diagonal line here. So this kind of aligns with this component value. Hodge is an 8 component value. Hodge also reasonably strong. The one downside is that if you are using a unit that does not benefit from both AD and AP, then this value goes down to about 5.0, which puts it kind of in line with down here, which is why if we go to the units that benefit from Hodge the most, especially in stage 6, I suspect they will have some type of AD and AP scaling, right? So I guess Viego doesn't, but both Renekton and Zed do. And of course, it's going to be better for melee units, but that's why I suspect like it's, well, yeah. Okay, so we're just doing Hodge. Declaw. Declaw has a lot of good component value, but 7.5 of it is in the MR. And then you get some max HP boost plus the HP regen, which in the early game... Oh wait, by the way, I want to look at adaptive here. So adaptive is good early, solid early, and then scales well, 52% late game. Declaw is so skewed on the AP side that it's basically a worthless item, especially as a first item early game, because your units are not going to have much max HP. The healing, because the max HP is low, your healing value is going to be low, and most of the damage done by opposing units in the early game is going to be attack damage oriented, which is why we'll see here Declaw in the early game is 60%. It's like one of the worst items in the early game. And when you think about it in terms of this component value, like you could basically view this as like a, I don't know, 1 or 2 component value in the early game, because most it's not really going to block much magic damage. QSS has 7.5, so very good, just all around stats. 2 of that is going to be on magic resist. So you definitely value this more on frontliners or melee units. Sorry, mainly melee units. If we put this on a backliner, this value goes down to 5.5. And I'm kind of like doing some middle ground for the attack speed buff that scales over time. But this is also why the value of QSS is, it's like solid, not amazing. Fights also last faster in the late game, so this scaling gets kind of like less valuable. Where is Quicksilver? Yeah. So I think people actually underestimate the value of Quicksilver in the early game. This analysis, by the way, was done before Graves got kind of popular. But the scaling up of QSS in the early game actually gives it quite a lot of attack speed, because this actually scales into like 2.7 components. And I kind of took a middle ground of 1.5. But in stage 2, it has a 58% round win rate. So yeah, so I guess this went down, but it actually does pretty well in the early game. If we think about, and this again goes back to the component value, right? I think a lot of people mainly value QSS from like my metaphor for QSS is like, oh, this is a CC immunity item. And so when I view it from that lens, I'm like, well, there's not much CC in the early game, so this is a shit item early. But that's not accounting for the fact that you're getting 2.7 components worth in an early game where the fights usually last longer, and so you are gaining 2.7 components in the early game as a result of this, which is why the stats for this actually look pretty good in the early game. All right, Death Cap 5. This comes out to around 7.3 component value. Damage amp is actually pretty hard to come by, so it's a scarce resource, which is quite good. And is slightly higher than Deathblade because you do have a little bit more damage amp, and that conversion rate for damage amps were slightly more than just the same flat amount of AD or AP. But you can basically view Deathblade and Deathcap both in the same ballpark. Very, very high efficiency component value compared to other standard damage items like Infinity Edge, Jewel Gauntlet, Last Whisper, stuff lower on the list. But the key thing is that it's less flexible, right? So you're gaining more component value for less flexibility, which and you can't really slam these early game, but if you can build these, it's some of the most just high concentration component value that you can get. And when we look at the item stats here, so Death Cap here and Deathblade here. So both of these high component values are on the kind of left side of the AVP chart. Bramble, similar to Declaw, has the HP boost, a little bit less armor, but also reduced damage from attacks. And the key thing here is that, one, the stats are going to be skewed by the Thorn-plated armor augment. But on top of that, the damage reduction and magic damage in the early game is going to be far more effective because most units are dealing attack damage in the early game. And so when we look at the stats for Bramble in the early game compared to Declaw, Declaw is 60% and Bramble is 70%. Now, a good amount of this is likely skewed by the augment, because you're more likely to choose the Bramble augment if you have like a 2-star tank. So you're more likely to already win streak, but this is much stronger in the early game. And if we think about the late game, Declaw versus Bramble Vest, late game, they're about the same. I suspect the combo of these two should be much better. Like actually, yeah, I have never actually looked at that. Bramble, Dragon's Claw. So if we do one without the other, 4.2 with Bramble, no Declaw. 4.4 with Declaw, no Bramble. But when we have both of them, it's a 4.0. So it just gets a lot more coverage, because if you just have one and you're playing against an AP comp, then this basically goes down to like one component of value, just the max HP, right? I mean, auto attacks have value too, but the combination of the two gets you a lot more coverage and gets you hyper efficiency across both of them. And so going back to adaptive gives you the benefit of both, gives you about half of Declaw's value on armor MR, or about 2/3 of Bramble's value, but gets you more coverage on both sides. All right, Giant Slayer gives you somewhere in between 6.75 to 9. And 9 is when you can get the full damage amp when you're attacking a unit that has a lot more HP. Downside is that you're not going to usually get that increase in damage amp until late game. And so if you're at 6.75, but you're only an AD user, you're actually getting around 4.25 in value if you don't get this damage amp bonus and you're only using one of the AD or AP, which is why people say Giant Slayer in the early game is usually not as good. The stats here say somewhat different in the early game, 66%, though I suspect you're only, part of that is skewed by survivorship bias, which is, I think people generally understand it's not good early game, and so you're only slamming it if you're trying to streak, which will skew this stat up. And if we go back to the items, Giant Slayer, pretty solid, like on this diagonal. Bloodthirster, 6.3 component value with a 25% HP shield. The stuff that I add a plus for, I'm not including in the component value because I couldn't find a good conversion rate. Yeah, BT Bloodthirster is where 61% early game, scales much better late game. Part of that is because the items, or sorry, the units that can use it are much better in the late game. This also uses both AD and AP, so you probably lose 1.5 of that value if your unit can't really benefit from the other damage type. Sterak's Gauge, by the way, I updated this for 14.6 stats, so it should account for that. We see here that this is a 6 in value, and because Sterak's is much more hyper-focused on AD as opposed to a mix of AD and AP, for example, with GS and Bloodthirster, if your unit can only use one damage type, you gotta basically deduct like 1 to 2 components here, which is why Sterak's is actually quite good. 40 AD is gonna be nearly the value of the Deathblade on the AD side. But also, if you have, especially if you have a unit that can leverage both of them, like Vi or some solid AD tank in the early game, this is very strong slam. We go to Sterak's, just solid stats all around, and then over here, Sterak's is one of the best items in the game. The HP shield percent is getting nerfed. I suspect that if we just look at the component value, though, like this shield, it should not decrease the strength of this item that much. All right, so now we have the Sunder versus Shred. Even Shroud here versus Spark is a 6 versus 5 component value. So this is why, like, I've heard Asa, for example, mention that Spark is basically not even a tank item. Like when you compare this to 5 versus 12 for adaptive or 13 for stoneplay, yeah, this is also why, especially after Void Staff the duration of the shred is getting increased, Void Staff should be superior to Spark in pretty much every instance. We go back to Even Shroud. The base stats are actually better because you're getting both armor and MR in the first 15 seconds. And so the value of Even Shroud is significantly better than Ionic Spark. Yeah, I kind of did a rough equivalent value of this, but if you account for the first 15 seconds, full value is actually 8 here. So Even Shroud is actually quite solid, and if we look at Even Shroud here, that's interesting that the average placement is worse. Go here. Even Shroud 65%, Spark 63%. I mean, early game, most of the damage is going to be AD oriented. So, like, yeah, this value is quite good in the early game. Void Staff, we can see here why it's so strong of an item, and I'm surprised they're buffing it because Last Whisper is like way down here, and it only sunders for 3 seconds versus this will shred for 5 seconds. So this is significantly better than Last Whisper for kind of the same function. If we just look at the component value, you'll see why, right? Last Whisper gives 4 component value, whereas Void Staff gives 6 component value, which is why it's actually quite good on your carry. Like if we view this compared to like Jewel Gauntlet, it actually has more component value on the base stats than Jewel Gauntlet. All right, Striker's Flail ranges from 5.5 to 8.5 depending on whether you could trigger the extra damage amp for crits, which is why this goes up if you already have an IE. Or if you're playing a higher attack speed champion, this value also goes up. I would actually be interested to know if, let's say for Xayah, when Xayah is casting her spell, does all the like daggers or whatever she throws, do each of those have a chance to crit? And if so, does that mean that your likelihood of getting this full stack goes up based off of or even like misfortune? Like, do each of her bullets have a chance to crit, or is it just like the whole ability cast combined? Because I think that drastically affects the value here, since it changes it from a 5.5 to a 8.5 component value. And that could basically make it be like a top end item. And we can see Striker's Flail here is very top tier here as well. And if we look at the stats, it performs much better relatively in the mid game, which is interesting, relative to other items. So if you happen to know that, please include a comment with the timestamp to this section of the video. Gunblade has pretty mediocre component value, 5.5, which is why this is pretty much a horrible early game slam. Just doesn't give you enough stats, and the Omnivamp heals you very little because unless you have 3 items, the heal value is very low. And so Gunblade is like okay here, but early game it's gonna be bad. Yeah, 59% early game, gets better in the mid game as you get more items. Warmog we already talked about. IE and Jewel Gauntlet are in the same boat. They both give you around 5.25 component value and the ability to crit, which if you are using it on a unit that values crit, that deals most of their damage from ability, like Brand or MF or Xayah, then this goes up in value a lot, especially if you're also building it with Striker's Flail. Blue buff has a 5 component value. If we compare this with Shojin, has 5 versus 4 component value here. So just from that, and that's not even including the damage amp on takedown, I don't believe. 2 plus 3, yeah. 5% damage amp on takedown. Like, this basically has significantly higher value on a low mana caster than Shojin for that reason. And when we look at blue buff here versus Shojin, I mean, Shojin's more flexible, so I don't think that really factors in. If we just, and this is where looking at the component value is usually more useful than finishing stats, because there are a lot of external variables that we're not including here. Whereas if we just look at this stat component value, we see that why blue buff is usually better than Shojin. Spark we talked about is just not a great item, especially with the buff in duration to Void Staff. You far prefer to have Void Staff. The challenge is that tier, if you're playing AP, is already hard to come by. And so that's the main downside of Void Staff. Steadfast Heart, I was unable to value this 10 to 18% durability. I suspect this durability should be valued very highly. Maybe even just one way of valuing it is like basically it's giving you the equivalent of like 10 to 18% more HP. I think it actually should be valued more than that. Which if we view it compared to this max HP, let's just say that's gonna be like 1 to 2 plus components, which will, I'll just say 1.3, so this is 6. And maybe this should be even higher. But when we look at the stats, Steadfast Heart is very solid tank item. And over here, went from 67%, one of the best early game slams, and still scales reasonably well into late game, better than Bramble and Dragonclaw. Crown Guard gives you AP, armor, HP, and a shield plus delayed AP. So I'm not including the delayed AP here or the shield value. But this delayed AP is like 2.5, right? So this goes up to like 7.25, which if you are using that's why it's so good on like a Mordekaiser. If you're using this on a AP tank, a tank that really scales well with AP, then this is significantly better. But otherwise, this AP value is oftentimes wasted on tank. So it's almost like if this AP can effectively boost your shield value by a lot and make your tank even tankier, then that can be quite good. Edge of Night is 4.5 value plus aggro drop, and it's 22 of this component value is in the armor, and it does give you attack speed later. But basically, this is like a 2.5 plus aggro drop. So you really gotta make sure you're making up for component value and damage somewhere else, because that most of this value in Edge of Night is gonna be from the aggro drop, which is why I think what is it? The augment that gives you Edge of Night. I always had a hard time valuing this, but basically this is, you view this as adding 3.5 components to this, which then brings it up to 8 base component value plus the aggro drop, which is a lot of value, which is also why it makes it viable on Vanguard Marksman. Yeah, I always had a hard time valuing like, oh, the incremental combat power from this stuff. But viewing it in component value simplifies it a lot. Red buff, 4.5 component value plus burn wound, which you definitely want burn wound at some point, but you do not want this on your main carry for that reason, because it's only 4.5 compared to even Gunblade, like later game, Striker's Flail, definitely better. Sterax even better, right? Like, well, part of it is survivability, but like even IE and Jewel Gauntlet gonna be better, just pure component value than red buff. Kraken's Fury, 4.5 base, but 2 of it is from MR, so this is like more like 2.5 base on your primary carry. So you really need to have a strong frontline and probably Guinsoo's combined with this for this to be worth it. And it also decreases in value in the late game because fights don't last as long. So this is extremely strong early game combined with Rageblade and a strong frontline. But Kraken's, if you don't have those conditions, is actually not a high component value item. Morello, similar to red buff, has, if you exclude the 150 HP component values, is actually 3.5 component value, so less valuable than red buff for that reason. At least red buff, all of these stats are like help your carry in some way. Yeah, so less valuable than red buff, and has HP value. Shojin, very low stats. We talked about that before. Benefits when your carry has more attack speed. Protector's Vow gives you 25% HP shield and 20 armor MR at 40% HP. Especially this armor MR is significantly less valuable. Like you could consider this to be 4 component value, but because it occurs at this 40% HP threshold, like it's basically less than half of that value, right? So I could consider this. So if normally the combined would be 40, 20 and 20, 4 components, what is that? 0.4 times 40, 16, 1.6 components. $5.6 plus the shield. Now, if you have some kind of built-in healing or shielding on the unit that can then make this unit survive a little bit longer, it should improve the component value on this piece of it. So let's move this up here. But Vow is basically inferior to Adaptive for that reason, unless you are playing like Sejuani, like a tank caster that really values this starting mana. Because if you exclude the starting mana, this goes down to a 3.6 value. Whereas if you exclude the starting mana here, it goes down to 11 value for frontliner. So adaptive much better than Vow on a tank that does not value the mana as much. LW, 4 component value plus Sunder, so I think inferior to Void Staff by a lot. But even Shroud like can die off first, so you still probably prefer LW in the late game, just so you have more uptime. But the stats on this are not amazing. And part of that goes to like, if you can choose, let's say you have Sword, Glove, Bow, if you could choose between IE versus LW early game, it's kind of questionable which one you prefer. I've seen people argue for both. Sunfire Cape, base stats are not that great, only a 4. It does do well in the early game. Sunfire Cape, 66% early game. So the thing is, this is probably survivorship bias as well. You're slamming this for more damage in the early game, and mainly if you are already strong, which will skew it, but it is solid for early game. But if we think about it in terms of the component value, you'd probably prefer, I mean, it's only slightly, like these are 4.5 versus this is 4 value, right? So mostly interchangeable. Nashor's Tooth, 3 base value plus 6 component value for the attack speed after cast. Which, if you're on a high mana champion, like this barely gets any value, and it happens late in the fight. Whereas for a unit specifically like Annie, she'll get more of this value, especially if it's combined with Shojin. Can get closer to like maybe 6 value, because she's not getting 100% uptime on this, right? But even if you include, even if you had 100% uptime, this is a 9. If you have 50% uptime, it's a 6. So this explains why Nashor's is generally a bad item. We go back here. Where's Nashor? Yeah, pretty much the worst item if you draw across this diagonal here. Declaw, Nashor, Kraken's like kind of in this low territory. Archangel Staff, 3+ scaling AP, similar to Rageblade here. Both of these just base is pretty poor, and so you need to have a strong front line for this to gain value. Same with Rageblade. Just because you slam this early, if your front line sucks, this is like not a lot of value. Let's say you get 10 seconds into the fight. That's 70% attack speed, which gives you 7 component value, which gets you 9 component value. But you can't just assume that's 9 component value, because you already missed like, a third or a half of the fight. And then on top of that, in late game, Rageblade value decreases as fights speed up. So similar to Archangel Staff. And if we look at Rageblade early game, it's like, it's okay. Archangel Staff early game, it's okay. Late game gets even worse because fights are shorter. So if you build these, you get way more component value if you are building a super tank. Or let's say you have a Dumbify or Golemify, then it goes up in value a lot. Spirit Visage, we can see here why it's so bad. I mean, it's pretty low here. And this is including, they went from 200 HP to 300 HP, so they improved it by 0.7 components. Giant spell is 150. I am not really valuing the 2.5% regen. I'm adding it here. But you can see here that the regen, I think the regen is missing HP as well. So this is just a overall like bad, 2.5% missing HP per second, whereas Declaw at least is max HP. So this is really only going to be good for like super tanks like Cho, and you already have 3 items, and it's a 2-star. So very circumstantial item, just generally pretty bad. Titan's Resolve, Base has 3, but can max at 17. Most of the time, though, you're not going to get the full stacks. And if and when you do get the full stacks, you're pretty much dead. So you're not really getting the full value of that, which is why Titans is really only good on super melee tanks like that can get to the full stacks and heal up. That's when you could get extreme value on this, right? So this is very circumstantial item, but can get a lot of value in the right circumstance. And then TG has 2 component value on the base stats plus 2 random items in value. All right, so that covers the analysis on how much is each TFT item worth. Hopefully this analysis gives you a better understanding of why each item is good and when, why it's good early game, mid game, late game, and how to value these items in a different way, especially when you consider that some of them, like Giant Slayer, are AD and AP. So you need to look at the AP or AD scaling for the unit to see how much of this component value they get. Thinking about component value by early and mid game, late game for Stoneplate, how long fights last in terms of the component value. And these are all ideas that I've generally understood well in the past, but thinking about it in component value, especially on augments like Not Today, for example, just simplifies the analysis a lot more and will allow me to perceive the game in a different way. You know, when we go back to this idea of the meta mindset of like your perception, your assumptions shape your perception or shape your reality, right? The metaphors that you use affect how you see the game. So I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something from it. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.